It was a Monday morning at Fort Liberty, the kind of Carolina heat that made every sound stick to the air. My hands smelled faintly of bleach and metal polish. The floor of the administrative wing reflected the fluorescent lights like an accusation. 3 years ago, I used to walk these halls in uniform head high, carrying a clearance badge that opened doors. Now, I carried a mop. My name was Captain Rowan Pierce once. To most people here, I was just Pierce the janitor. The air shifted before I heard her. Linda Pierce, my stepmother. Her heels clicked across the marble, steady, sharp, deliberate. She always made an entrance like she owned the building. She had a small entourage with her 2 wives of senior officers, their laughter trimmed and polished like their pearls. I could smell her perfume before I looked up. She stopped in front of me. "You're still here?" Her voice was silk stretched thin over something sharper. "Guess the Army found the perfect job for a failure." The other women chuckled politely, the kind of laugh people use when they want to stay on the winning side. I kept my head down, hands steady on the mop handle. She stepped closer until her shadow cut through the light. "You always had ambition, Rowan," she said softly. "But ambition without loyalty is dangerous." Her eyes lingered on the mop water, then on my name patch. He would be ashamed to see this? She meant my father, General Marcus Pierce. I lifted my gaze to the framed photo on the wall, him in dress uniform, shaking hands with a Secretary of Defense long gone. He had believed in integrity above everything. I met her eyes. "He'd be ashamed of what you've become?" For a second, the air went still. One of the wives pretended to cough. Linda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. She tilted her head the way she always did before cutting someone to pieces with words. "Careful, dear," she said. "You wouldn't want to add insubordination to your resume." I wanted to laugh. My resume had already been rewritten by her hands. The sound that came out of me wasn't laughter, though, just a short breath I couldn't swallow back. I pressed the mop harder into the floor until the wood of the handle bit into my palm. When I lifted it again, there was a small smear of blood. Linda looked down at it and smiled. "Discipline builds character," she said, turning away. Her entourage followed, their perfume trailing behind like victory smoke. I watched her reflection disappear into the glass doors. My pulse steadied, but the sting in my palm stayed. Across the hall, a young private hesitated, unsure whether to look at me or the floor. I nodded once. He nodded back, eyes wide, like he'd just witnessed something dangerous. Maybe he had. I stared at the mop water, the faint trace of red swirling through gray. It looked almost beautiful in the fluorescent light. My father used to tell me that the hardest battles aren't fought on battlefields but in hallways, in boardrooms, in silence. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I did. Every humiliation has its own sound. The echo of her heels, the soft laughter, the word failure. I heard them all at once, overlapping like static in my head. I could have walked away from this place, left the uniform, left the past, but something inside me refused to. That same something that kept me breathing when they took my rank, my clearance, my name. I looked again at my father's photo. He used to quote an old saying whenever I doubted myself: "Truth isn't lost, it's buried under fear." I whispered it now so low no one else could hear. They buried the truth once. I'll dig it out. I gathered my cleaning cart and pushed it down the corridor, my reflection in the polished floor fading and reappearing with each step. Outside the window, flags stirred lazily in the hot air. Somewhere in another building, an intercom crackled with orders. The base kept moving like nothing in it had changed. But I had. The humiliation didn't crush me. It compressed something inside me until it was sharper. I wasn't a captain anymore, but I still knew how to plan an operation. I still knew how to wait. People think waiting is weakness. They're wrong. Waiting is strategy. Waiting is survival. As I reached the end of the hallway, I paused by the maintenance closet and leaned my forehead against the door. The metal was cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and pictured my father's handwriting, his signature on a document I once saw Linda hide after the funeral. My instincts whispered that it wasn't over. That paper was the beginning. The sound of her laughter still echoed down the hall, distant now, but unforgettable. Every story has a turning point. Mine would begin here in bleach and silence under fluorescent light. The day my stepmother sneered was the day I stopped being ashamed. Have you ever been humiliated by someone who thought you'd never rise again? Tell me below, I read every comment. 3 years earlier, before the mop, before the humiliation, I wore a uniform that still smelled of static from command briefings and coffee that burned your throat after 16-hour shifts. I was Captain Rowan Pierce Cyber Operations Division stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. My job was simple on paper, but complex in reality, find weaknesses before the enemy did. I believed in that mission. I believed in the system. Back then, my father was still alive. General Marcus Pierce. The kind of man whose name could silence a room not because of fear, but because of respect. He'd taught me that loyalty meant nothing without integrity. I tried to live by that. It made me enemies I didn't see coming. The day everything began unraveling started like any other, a security breach flag from one of the radar relay nodes in the Pacific. It looked routine, but the data packets had strange latency spikes signatures that didn't belong. I traced them for 40 hours straight through layers of proxy tunnels until I found something impossible, a duplicate encryption stamp linked to an internal Department of Defense account. It wasn't foreign, it was domestic. I sent my findings to our compliance chain. They never came back. 2 days later, my commanding officer called me in. The room was cold, the blinds half drawn. "Captain Pierce," he said, eyes careful. "We've received concerns about your conduct. You've been accused of mishandling classified information." I thought I misheard him. I asked who accused me. He avoided my eyes. I saw the file in his hand, a red tag on top. "You're being reassigned pending review." My clearance was frozen within the hour. My ID card beeped red at every door. I remember the taste in my mouth like static and rust. That night, I drove home through the rain, the base lights fading behind me, wondering how fast loyalty could turn into suspicion. At my apartment, the TV was already on. Linda Pierce sat on the couch wearing one of my father's old service pins on her lapel. She looked up with a calm expression. "Rough day?" she asked. I stood dripping near the doorway. "You knew." It wasn't a question. She folded her hands. "You can't expect the system to trust someone who overreaches deer. Your father warned you about that." I laughed once a dry sound. "No. He warned me about you." She tilted her head like she was evaluating a child's tantrum. "You've been so emotional since his passing. Maybe a break from all that classified stress will do you good." The way she said emotional made it sound like unstable, like dangerous. I could almost see the words she'd used in her report. She'd been advising the oversight board as a civilian consultant since my father's death. I realized she'd used that access to redirect suspicion toward me. Why, I asked. Because I was looking where I shouldn't have. Her eyes didn't flicker. "Because you forgot your place." I wanted to yell. Instead, I stood still, watching her sip tea from my father's mug. That image burned itself into my memory, the sound of the spoon, the steady click of her nails against porcelain. A week later, I was officially reassigned to Fort Liberty, North Carolina, temporary administrative support. It meant exile, no command duties, no cyber network access, just paperwork supply chains and silence. I spent nights in base housing, staring at a box of old commendations I couldn't hang on the walls because it felt dishonest. I wrote appeals that were never answered. Every day I waited for my phone to ring with an explanation. It never did. At night, I'd think of my father's last conversation with me. It was 2 days before his heart failed in his sleep. He had called me from the field office and said, "Rowan, remember something. Truth isn't lost. It's buried under fear. Don't let anyone bury you." I didn't know he'd die 48 hours later. At his funeral, Linda stood at the podium wearing black gloves and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She talked about duty, about love, about carrying on his legacy through the foundation she planned to establish in his name. I stood among officers listening, my uniform starched and heavy, my throat too tight to breathe. When the flag was folded and handed to her, she didn't look at me. After that, she started rewriting history. She turned herself into the grieving widow, the moral voice of his legacy. I became the problem child. The rumors followed fast how I'd cracked under pressure, how I'd compromised a file out of arrogance. No one asked me. They just looked away when I passed. On a military base, silence spreads faster than orders. At Fort Liberty, the days blurred. The hum of generators outside the admin building became my clock. I stopped wearing my insignia because it only made people whisper louder. I'd catch reflections of myself in polished windows and not recognize the woman looking back. The shine in her eyes was gone. But beneath that stillness, something else was growing. A quiet resolve. I had spent years teaching soldiers how to protect networks, how to detect infiltration patterns. Now I was living inside one, except this network was made of people, and the virus wore perfume. Sometimes when I cleaned out old storage or filed requisitions, I'd find remnants of my old world, an encrypted drive, a disconnected terminal, a report format I'd once designed. They reminded me who I used to be. The fall wasn't sudden. It was slow erosion. A series of quiet humiliations, a locked door, a missing badge, a whisper in a hallway. But every erosion leaves a trace of what it destroys. That trace is where rebuilding begins. One evening, months after my reassignment, I got a letter in the mailroom. No return address, just my name typed. Inside was a small photo of my father standing in front of the Pentagon, and behind him, barely visible Linda's reflection in the glass door. A note on the back read, "He trusted the wrong person. I didn't know who sent it, but I kept it. It sat in my pocket like a heartbeat." That was when the shame started to turn into something else. Not anger, not yet just focus. The humiliation on base later wasn't new. It was a symptom of the same disease. But I wasn't broken anymore. I was waiting for a pattern to reveal itself. Every system, no matter how corrupt, eventually repeats its own mistake. And when it does, you trace it back to the source. In Fort Liberty's maintenance bay, I began keeping small notes in an old field manual, dates, names, access logs, anything I remembered from Fort Meade. It wasn't evidence yet, just breadcrumbs. But every breadcrumb led closer to the woman who called herself my mother. I told myself I'd never confront her again. I was wrong. Because in the world she built silence was complicity, and I'd already been silent too long. Months passed before the pattern showed itself. I was updating supply manifests one night when a shipment order caught my eye. The invoice listed data infrastructure equipment, Memorial Cyber Grant Office of Civil Partnerships. It was signed by Linda Pierce. My hands froze on the keyboard. That grant name, Marcus Pierce Memorial, was something she'd announced after my father's death. I thought it was symbolic a scholarship or charity fund. But this order wasn't for scholarships. It was for high-end servers, encryption hardware, and foreign contractor routing. I opened the requisition tree line by line until I saw an address block linked to a civilian contractor in Zurich. That was not standard. Nothing in the U.S. procurement system routes through Swiss vendors unless it's financial. I knew immediately what I was looking at, a laundering loop disguised as a government initiative. I sat back in the chair, heart pounding. She'd buried it inside his name. I whispered out loud, "You used him." The base was quiet except for the hum of lights. Somewhere outside, a generator cut in and I jumped. I printed the page, folded it once, and slipped it into my boot. That single document was the first breadcrumb that pointed to how she had weaponized legacy and trust. I understood then that my downfall wasn't random, it was engineered. Someone had to take the fall to clear her path. That someone had been me. I started tracing every shipment code that mentioned the memorial grant. Most were routed through DoD external partnerships, but the subledger listed a consultant approval ID, LP3742. Linda Pierce's digital signature. I wanted to scream. Instead, I documented everything on handwritten notes and stored them in an old cleaning supply locker behind the maintenance bay under rags and polish cans. No one checked there. Every night, I'd copy one more detail. I became a ghost in my own base, invisible but listening. I'd walk through corridors where officers once saluted me and now avoided my eyes. I realized power doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. When stripped of authority, it becomes observation. And observation can be lethal. There was one person I trusted enough to test my theory, Major Ethan Ward, stationed in Norfolk. He and I had served in the same cyber ops rotation years before. We hadn't spoken since the investigation, but his name still showed up in internal message directories. I typed out a message from an anonymous terminal. Need to confirm identity duplication within DoD grant database. Personal risk high. RP. I didn't expect a reply. It came 12 hours later. Meet me halfway. Norfolk parking facility. Midnight tomorrow. The next evening, I borrowed a base vehicle and drove through the back roads of North Carolina into Virginia. The sky was dark rain drumming steady. Ethan was waiting in a gray sedan, engine running. He looked older, sharper, same analytical eyes. "You should have called someone else," he said quietly. "Your name's radioactive." I handed him the printed page. "Then burn it after you read it." He scanned it, his brow tightening. "She's not just consulting Rowan. This code sequence these contractors are ghost shells. She's moving money under classified umbrellas." "In my father's name," I said. He looked up. "You understand what happens if you're wrong. I was already destroyed for being right once." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the space between sentences. Then he said, "I'll check it from my end. Quietly. You stay out of it." But I didn't. Over the next weeks, he'd send me coded updates through maintenance shipment labels, tiny anomalies in numbers that told me what he found. One night, he confirmed it, accounts offshore. Names match foundation board. One beneficiary, L. Pierce. The words blurred in front of me. Proof. It wasn't just betrayal, it was desecration. She'd taken everything my father built and turned it into a personal vault. But proving it meant risking everything again. I kept remembering his last words, how truth hides under fear. So I pushed. I began reconstructing the digital trail she'd left behind during her consultant reviews. Each file she approved bore an identical digital fingerprint, one only she could have used because she had access to his old encryption key, the key he never shared while alive. That meant she had either stolen or duplicated it after his death. That realization hit like an electric current. I went cold. That key had been stored in a classified archive tied to our family trust, accessible only to next of kin through the Department of Defense legal office. The next of kin had been updated to her after the funeral. My clearance had been revoked. It fit perfectly. She had rewritten the paperwork. The fraud wasn't just financial, it was identity level. She had literally rewritten the bloodline of trust. I started keeping a coded journal, not for evidence yet, but for clarity. Every entry began with a question my father used to ask his officers. What did you miss today that might matter tomorrow? The first few entries were messy, then patterns emerged. Same vendors, same amounts, same approval window at 0300 every Thursday. She was moving $10 million through small partitions of projects, none large enough to raise alarms, but collectively massive. The Foundation's public face made it untouchable, and every time I looked at her photo from the funeral, that faint smile told me she knew exactly how invisible she'd become. The breaking point came one evening when I attended a remembrance ceremony for fallen officers. Linda was there, surrounded by admirals and directors, her pearls glinting under the soft lights. When she spotted me at the back of the hall, she smiled. It wasn't warmth, it was warning. She walked over during intermission, lowering her voice. "You should really let go of the past, Rowan. People forgive mistakes, but they don't forget insubordination." I looked straight at her. "You taught me that fear keeps people obedient, but it doesn't keep them blind." She laughed softly, leaning in. "Careful. Curiosity is contagious. You wouldn't want others catching yours." She touched my shoulder and walked away. Her perfume lingered expensive and clinical. The room spun with applause for the next speech. I stayed seated, hands locked together, heartbeat steady. I realized something then: she wasn't afraid, because no one had ever made her answer to anyone. That would change. The humiliation she'd given me on base months later would only harden what this night began. I returned to Fort Liberty with a purpose that felt surgical. I might not have rank anymore, but I had proximity. I knew how systems breathed, how bureaucracy hid secrets in plain sight. I was going to turn her own machinery against her. The fall had stripped away everything that wasn't necessary: pride, comfort, reputation. What remained was precision. I stopped writing appeals and started writing plans. Not for revenge, but for exposure. Revenge rots. Exposure reforms. That was my difference. My father's voice echoed each night when I reviewed the notes. Truth isn't lost, it's buried under fear. I smiled once faintly. Then I'll be the shovel. That winter, an internal memo circulated across Fort Liberty. The Department of Defense Cyber Initiative was reopening grants for development under the Marcus Pierce Memorial Foundation. It was her biggest move yet. I didn't see it as her triumph. I saw it as her mistake. Because this time, I was watching. The same woman who had taken everything from me was about to hand me the one opportunity to bring her down. The night the spark caught, I wasn't looking for it. I was alone in the storage wing finishing another long shift after the officers' gala. The halls of Fort Liberty were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin until you can hear your own breath. The janitor's closet smelled of ammonia and dust, the air thick with the hum of fluorescent lights. I moved a box of outdated routers and something clattered behind it, a small black drive coated in grime. I picked it up. Its label was half scratched off, but I could make out the engraving PRC logs. The initials made my pulse tighten. Pierce Research Command, my father's old task force, the same name that disappeared from official records after his death. For a long moment, I just stared at the drive, turning it in my fingers. Dust smeared across my glove, the metal faintly warm, as if it had been handled recently. I slid it into my pocket and closed the closet door. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan clicked like a metronome, marking every thought I tried to push away. By 0200, I was sitting at my old field laptop, the kind no one bothered to confiscate when they stripped my clearance. I booted it in offline mode, no network. If this was what I thought it was, connecting it to the base system would trigger every alarm from here to Norfolk. I inserted the drive. The screen went black, then filled with a slow loading sequence. Line after line of encrypted metadata scrolled upward, project tags, funding codes, signatures. I knew this format. It was DoD grant infrastructure. My breath hitched when I read one name repeating through the metadata, Marcus Pierce Memorial Foundation. I leaned closer, scrolling. The sums were enormous, 10 million dispersed in structured transfers across contractor accounts. I clicked the first routing log. Zurich, the second. Singapore, the third. Arlington, Virginia. Linda's city. I sat back staring at the screen. The world seemed to narrow around that single name, looping over and over through the digital chain. She'd used my father's memorial fund not as a tribute, but as a pipeline. I felt something inside me shift from disbelief to clarity. All the humiliation, the reassignment, the quiet smears, it had been the smokescreen for this. She hadn't just taken my career. She had taken his name. At dawn, I walked to the edge of the base past the motor pool where mist clung to the ground. The sky was pink and gray, the world between night and day. I took out my phone, hesitating. Then I dialed a number I'd deleted years ago. Ethan Ward, Major now stationed in Norfolk. I didn't expect him to answer. He did. Rowan, he said, and the way he said my name told me he'd heard every rumor. It's been a while. I found something I said quietly, and if I'm right, it ties back to my father's foundation. There was silence on the line. You're not supposed to have access to anything related to that, he said finally. I know, but I do. Another pause. I could almost hear him thinking through the risk. Meet me off base. Tomorrow night. Bring the drive. We met behind an auto shop off a side road outside Fayetteville, a place where no one would recognize a captain and a major speaking in hushed tones over a dusty tailgate. Ethan looked older, but sharper, his uniform jacket crisp even off duty. He watched me slide the drive from my pocket. If this is what you say it is, you could go to prison just for opening it. I handed it over. If I'm right, someone else should. He plugged it into his tablet, his eyes scanning the code. I saw his expression change, professional calm, slipping into disbelief. This isn't random. These are Pentagon-level approvals. Someone forged clearance signatures. Her name's on all of it, I said. Linda Pierce, consultant for the Memorial Foundation. Ethan shook his head slowly. Rowan, you realize what this means. This isn't just financial misconduct. This is classified misrepresentation, national-level fraud. She used his name to hide it, I said. She made me the scapegoat so no one would look at her. He stared at me for a long moment. You sure you want to go down this road again? I already went down it once, I said. I'm still here. He exhaled through his teeth, closing the tablet. I'll help you, but we do this clean. No leaks, no outside networks. You'll have to trust me. I did once, I said. That's how I survived this long. We set the plan in motion quietly. He would run parallel verification from Norfolk's cyber division using his own chain of clearance. I would look for physical traces, contracts, procurement receipts, anything linking Linda's consultant ID to the memorial fund. The base became a map of clues. Every hallway, every supply log, every conversation I overheard was a thread waiting to be pulled. Over the following weeks, the spark grew into something sharper. Ethan confirmed that the grant proposals under Linda's name had been mirrored in the DoD system by a duplicate ID. He couldn't trace who authorized the duplicate, it was buried too deep, but he found one anomaly that tied directly to me. My name. My old access credentials, supposedly deactivated, had been used to verify one of her submissions a month after my clearance was revoked. It was the final insult. She hadn't just destroyed my career. She had used my identity as her cover. I felt something like fire under my ribs, a steady burn that no longer came from shame, but from purpose. I spent nights cataloging everything in a notebook small enough to fit in my boot, the handwriting small disciplined. Each detail felt like reclaiming a piece of my voice. The humiliation from Fort Liberty had become evidence, every insult, now a record of intent. She thought she'd reduced me to silence. But silence can be a weapon if you learn how to aim it. By the end of that month, Ethan called with a whisper that sounded like electricity. Rowan, it's real. $10 million approved through duplicated grant IDs. It's all under her consultant code. I closed my eyes. Then we know what we're dealing with. He hesitated. Be careful. If she suspects you, she'll shut it down. Let her, I said, because I'm not just looking anymore. I'm baiting her. The moment I decided to bait her, the fear vanished. There was only calculation. She had built her shield out of respectability, but systems like hers depend on one thing: control. And control can be disrupted. The idea came to me while reviewing one of my father's old memos I had saved years before, titled Counter-Proposal Ethics. It described how mirrored submissions could expose duplicated authorization codes during funding audits. If I could create a legitimate proposal using my father's memorial ID, the system itself would flag the conflict. No hacking, no illegal access, just administrative precision. I would use her arrogance against her. I spent the next week preparing every document, staying late in the maintenance office where no one asked questions. My hands smelled of cleaning fluid while I typed my ID badge, tucked away the hum of the old desktop, filling the silence. Each section of the proposal was crafted with military discipline focused on cyber ethics and transparency. I even quoted my father's words in the mission statement, "Integrity is the firewall of every nation." When I printed the draft, the title stared back at me. Cyber Ethics Defense Initiative. Marcus Pierce Memorial Counterproposal. It looked clean, official, unstoppable. I met Ethan at a diner off Route 13, a place with bad coffee and better anonymity. He read through the document, frowning. You're not submitting this under your real clearance, right? No. I'll use the open contractor portal. It's public-facing, but routes into the same audit database. He nodded slowly, calculating the risk. If the system catches the duplicate, it'll auto-freeze both submissions for review. That's the idea, I said. It'll trigger a cross-verification of every approval ID tied to her foundation. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his jaw. You realize she'll trace it back to you the second it happens. I looked him in the eye. Then she'll know I'm not afraid of her anymore. He didn't argue. He just sighed, a long sound that carried both warning and respect. All right, Captain. Let's do it. That was the first time in years someone called me by my rank without sarcasm. 2 nights later, I logged into the contractor submission system from a terminal in the personnel wing, timing it between maintenance updates so no one would monitor traffic. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every keystroke sounded like thunder. I uploaded the proposal, checked the routing field twice, then clicked Submit. The screen blinked once, then displayed a single line. Submission received. Audit pending. I sat back staring at those words. It was done. No alarms, no drama. Just a seed planted in the machine. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, quietly, things began to shift. The IT division received an internal notice about conflicting project codes under the Memorial Foundation umbrella. The message was routine, technical, nothing alarming, but I knew it had begun. Ethan confirmed the next phase when he called from Norfolk. They've escalated it to internal auditing. 2 proposals with identical IDs. One from a civilian consultant, one from an unregistered contractor. She'll see it soon. I asked, how long until she realizes it's me? He paused. She already knows. The next morning, when I entered the admin hall, people turned slightly when I passed. Whispers followed. She had started the quiet campaign again, the same one she used to destroy me before. Only this time I didn't flinch. I kept my pace steady, head high. She needed me, rattled, visible, reactive. I gave her nothing. That afternoon, an officer told me there was a visitor waiting in the corridor. I knew before I saw her. Linda stood by the window, her reflection splitting the light in two. She wore civilian attire, immaculate as always, her ID lanyard glinting. "We need to talk," she said softly. "I'm on duty," I replied. "This won't take long." She stepped closer. "You've been busy." Her tone was calm, but her eyes gave her away. She was calculating the extent of what I knew. "You think you can play hero again, do you?" After everything, I didn't answer. The silence between us thickened until she filled it herself. "You never learned when to stop. You never learned how small you really are." I kept my voice low. "And you never learned how loud the truth gets when you try to bury it." Her expression flickered for the first time, a tiny crack in the perfect facade. Then she smiled again, brittle. "Be careful, Rowan. I would hate for you to lose what little you have left." She walked away before I could reply, her perfume lingering like static. When the door closed behind her, I finally exhaled. The confrontation wasn't victory. It was confirmation. She was scared not of exposure yet, but of unpredictability. That was enough. That night, Ethan sent a final encrypted message. The audit's live. Central review in 72 hours. If it's clean, her name clears. If not, she's done. I stared at the screen, my reflection fractured in the glow. The fear I'd carried for years was gone. What replaced it was something colder, steadier. For the first time since my reassignment, I felt in command again. I sat on the barracks step, watching the sun bleed out over the training fields. Soldiers passed laughter echoing in the distance. None of them knew what was happening beneath the surface, that a quiet war was unfolding, not with weapons, but with data and resolve. I touched the old drive still in my pocket, the one that started all this. It was scratched, now worn smooth at the edges like a relic. My father used to say, integrity wasn't a speech you gave, it was a test you failed until you passed it the hard way. Maybe this was my test. Somewhere inside the Pentagon's servers, 2 identical files were waiting to collide. When they did, one woman's empire would begin to collapse. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready. The invitation wasn't for me, but it found its way into my locker anyway. A folded cream envelope embossed with the gold insignia of Fort Liberty Officers Club slipped between the cleaning logs as if by accident. My name wasn't printed on it, only a simple line written in looping penmanship I knew too well, attendance required. LP. She didn't need to sign her full name. I knew it. Everyone knew it. That night, the Officers Club gleamed like a jewel under the fluorescent lights. Polished floors, brass plaques, the smell of cologne and bourbon drifting through laughter. They were celebrating some new logistics partnership, nothing that mattered except to those climbing the ladder. But Linda Pierce didn't throw dinners for nothing. Every event was theater, every audience a mirror to her ego. I arrived early wearing the plain uniform of custodial staff. My badge was clipped low, my sleeves rolled a mop and bucket, my only props. If she wanted to put me on display, I would let her, but on my terms. As I moved through the hall, I caught glimpses of the people who used to salute when I passed. Some looked away. Others stared guilt disguised as pity. I smiled at none of them. The chandelier light glinted off silverware as officers' wives clustered near the piano, gossiping in low tones. At the center of the room stood Linda, impeccable as ever in her navy silk suit, a brooch shaped like an eagle at her lapel. She laughed too loudly at something a colonel's wife said, her hand resting on the woman's arm in that perfectly rehearsed gesture of dominance. Then her gaze found me, and her smile sharpened like glass. "Well," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention, "if it isn't our most dedicated staff member. Captain Pierce, or do they call you Miss?" "Now." Laughter bubbled from the group around her, the kind that cuts without needing a knife. I kept my face neutral, lowering my eyes in professional silence. That only made her bolder. "You always had such a sense of duty," she continued, sipping her wine. "Even when you were misdirected." She let the word hang in the air, soft but poisonous. The colonel's wife giggled behind her napkin. I set the mop aside and straightened, keeping my tone even. "Just doing my part, ma'am." She tilted her head. "I'm sure you are. The Army always finds a place for everyone, even the misplaced." Another ripple of laughter. The air in the room grew thick, all eyes turning toward me. The part of me that had once wanted to disappear was long gone. Now every insult was data, every witness another variable in the equation I was building. I nodded once deliberately. "We all serve differently, ma'am. Some of us clean the mess. Some create it." For a second silence, then a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, the closest she'd come to losing control. She recovered quickly. "Watch your tone," she said lightly. "Someone might think you've forgotten your place." I met her gaze fully, then unflinching. "I remember exactly where I stand." The colonel nearby shifted uncomfortably. He knew tension when he heard it. Linda smiled again, that mask of warmth refitted. "You always had your father's temper. Pity you didn't inherit his restraint." I could have said 100 things in that moment about the forged grants, the stolen legacy, the falsified approvals, but not yet. Not here. I simply bowed my head slightly and turned away. My silence was louder than any retort. As the night went on, I moved through the tables, serving quietly, listening. Snippets of conversation drifted: budget allocations, defense contracts, gossip about who was getting promoted. It was a map of influence, and Linda was at the center of it, weaving her control like a spider. I caught fragments of her conversation with Colonel Mason, my old superior, the one who had presided over my disciplinary hearing years ago. "She was brilliant once," Linda said with feigned sadness. "But grief can make people unstable. Poor thing still hasn't recovered." I gripped the tray tighter, forcing my expression to stay calm. Mason's voice was cautious. "You're sure she's not involved in anything?" Linda laughed, soft and dismissive. "Please. Rowan's barely capable of managing a broom, let alone a breach." He chuckled weakly. "I suppose you'd know best." "I usually do," she said. The tray trembled slightly in my hand, the glasses rattling like a warning. I steadied them, focusing on the rhythm of my breathing. She was digging her own hole, one public insinuation at a time. And when the truth surfaced, those same officers would remember these words and question every one of them. Toward the end of the dinner, a toast was called. Crystal glasses raised champagne, catching the light. Linda stood to give the closing remarks. To integrity, she began the irony, almost making me laugh. "To the men and women who uphold our nation's honor on and off the field." Her voice was smooth, commanding the kind people mistake for sincerity. I stood by the door, watching her silhouette framed by applause. When the clapping died down, she turned slightly, her gaze finding me again. "And to those who remind us that service comes in many forms," she added, smiling with deliberate sweetness. "Even the humblest work can have dignity when done with obedience." A few guests laughed politely. It was the kind of backhanded praise that left no mark but bled anyway. I nodded once, just enough for her to see. But what she didn't know was that Ethan was watching from the service corridor, disguised as part of the catering team. He caught my eye and gave the faintest nod. Our plan was already moving beneath her perfect evening. After the guests dispersed, I began cleaning the tables. The chatter faded to distant echoes. Linda lingered by the piano, sipping from a glass alone, now that her audience was gone. "You handled that well," she said without turning. "Some people would have made a scene." "That's not my style," I said softly. "No, you prefer to work in the shadows." Just like your father. She placed the glass down, finally facing me. Her expression shifted, less social charm, more steel. I know what you're doing, Rowan. I don't know how, but I can feel it. You should stop before you destroy what's left of your reputation. I stepped closer until the polished floor reflected both of us. You already destroyed it once. I'm just reclaiming the evidence. Her eyes narrowed. You always mistake defiance for strength. That was your father's flaw, too. No, I said quietly. His flaw was trusting you. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Just silence. The kind that cracks porcelain. She turned away sharply, gathering her purse. You have no idea what you're playing with. Maybe not, I said, but I know what I'm fighting for. Her hand froze on the strap, the faintest tremor betraying her composure. Be careful, she murmured. Even truth can bury you if you dig too deep. I watched her leave the door, closing behind her like the end of a command. When I stepped outside, the night was cold, the air carrying the scent of pine and jet fuel from the flight line. I stood on the steps of the club, looking up at the stars faintly veiled by clouds. Behind me, the echo of the evening still lingered. Laughter glasses her voice. Every sound carved deeper into the memory I'd weaponize later. Ethan appeared from the shadows, his jacket collar turned up. You handled that better than I would have, he said. You were right, I replied. She knows something's coming. She just doesn't know when. He handed me a folded sheet of paper. Audit confirmation. The review's scheduled for next week in D.C. That's your window. I took it, the edges cutting faintly into my palm. Then it's time, I said. She wanted a show. Let's give her one. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of our boots on pavement the only rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet played the last note of taps fading into stillness. I thought about my father, then his medals, his words, the way he believed integrity was armor. Maybe it still was. Mine was just dented, scarred, but still intact. That night, as I packed my things in the small barracks room, I caught my reflection in the window. The uniform wasn't there anymore, but the resolve was. Tomorrow, I would leave Fort Liberty behind, and the next time I saw Linda Pierce, it wouldn't be on her stage. It would be on mine. Leaving Fort Liberty felt like shedding a skin I'd never wanted. The next morning, I drove north through Carolina fog, the horizon breaking open toward Virginia. Ethan had already arranged a safe desk in Norfolk's cyber division, officially listed as a temporary contractor support position, but we both knew what it really was, a silent war room. The office sat in a gray building off base, buried between warehouses where no one asked too many questions. When I walked in, Ethan was already surrounded by screens, the glow of code reflecting off his glasses. You're late, he said, half smiling. I stopped to buy cleaning gloves. They're lucky for me, he chuckled. You might want something stronger than luck. On the table lay printed data sheets from the initial audit sweep. 2 sets of approvals, both signed with the same encryption key. One under Marcus Pierce Memorial Foundation, the other under DoD Cyber Defense Grant Program. Both routed through identical contractor nodes, Zurich, Singapore, Arlington. It was beautiful in its precision, monstrous in its audacity. Linda hadn't just mirrored one document, she'd mirrored the whole system. How many people know, I asked? Right now, us. And maybe the algorithm that flagged it. Then we stay invisible. He nodded, pulling up a screen filled with binary strings. This is the checksum from her authorization packet. And this, he tapped another window, is yours from 3 years ago before they revoked your clearance. The hashes matched perfectly. She reused my ID, I whispered. Not exactly. She spoofed it, took fragments from your deactivated key and wrapped them inside hers like camouflage. My jaw clenched. So she's been laundering through my identity all along. Looks that way. But this gives us leverage. We can trace where that cloned key originated. Pentagon Terminal. He shook his head. Too many relays. But every cloned ID leaves a registration fingerprint. If we can extract it, we can prove who generated it. Do it, I said. He raised an eyebrow. That's not exactly legal. Neither was framing an officer, I said. He smiled slightly. Fair point. For days, we worked in silence, taking turns, sleeping in shifts, on a couch that smelled of old leather and coffee. Each file we decrypted revealed another layer of her network consultants' offshore accounts, shell companies disguised as veterans' nonprofits. I saw my father's name over and over used as branding as trust. He'd built his life on service and she'd used it to sell corruption. The deeper we dug, the more personal it became. Late one night, Ethan looked up from his terminal. You ever wonder why she did it? She already had money status. Control, I said. It's always about control. Money's just the leash. He studied me for a moment. And you? What's this about for you, Justice? I said quietly. Not revenge. Revenge is fast. Justice takes patience. He smiled faintly. You sound like your father. Maybe I'm finally listening. By the end of that week, we'd mapped her entire grant architecture. Every approval code led back to a single mainframe, a secured contractor node registered to the Department of Defense's Civilian Oversight Office. The same department Linda served as consultant. She's using her own office as the smokescreen, Ethan muttered. That's bold even for her. She thinks she's untouchable. I leaned forward. So we show her she's not. We needed another pair of eyes, someone still inside the system. That's when Ethan called in an old contact, Sergeant First Class Dana Quinn, an analyst in the Army Inspector General's IT branch. Dana was sharp, discreet, and owed Ethan a favor from Kabul. She arrived late one night wearing civilian clothes and nerves. You two realize this is career suicide, she said, glancing between us. Good thing I'm already out of a career, I said. She cracked a small grin. All right, Captain Pierce, show me what you've got. Ethan projected the data onto the wall flow charts, transaction routes, ID timestamps. Dana studied them in silence, her brow furrowing. These routes bypass procurement entirely. She's feeding through discretionary grant channels. Nobody audits those unless there's a flag. There will be, Ethan said. Rowan's proposal triggered the duplicate ID check. It's only a matter of time. Dana nodded slowly. Then you'll need proof ready before the review hits. Otherwise, she'll claim administrative error and sweep it. I crossed my arms. So, we get the proof. Where does it live? She hesitated. Pentagon internal servers. Civilian oversight drive cluster. Access requires multi-key clearance. You have one key, Ethan said. We can forge the other two. Dana exhaled sharply. You're asking me to risk my clearance. I met her eyes. I'm asking you to help expose someone who's been stealing from your own department. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached into her pocket and placed a small flash drive on the table. You'll have 40 minutes before the system flags unauthorized entry. You better make them count. The plan was set. We'd initiate a mirrored access from a proxy terminal in Norfolk, bounce through 2 clean relays, and infiltrate the Pentagon node long enough to pull Linda's master file, Project Alpha 10M. It was the foundation of her fraud, the document she'd used to authorize every disbursement. Once we had it, the checksum would prove she'd forged the encryption signature. The next night, the operation began. The office lights were dim, only the glow of screens illuminating the room. Ethan handled the network routing. Dana monitored the intrusion trace. My hands hovered over the keyboard, steady but tight. When the system opened the authorization window, I entered the cloned key sequence Ethan had reconstructed from my revoked credentials. For a second, the cursor blinked and then the directory unfolded like a map of crimes. Files labeled Grant Memorial Audit Contractor, List, Restricted Overhead, Ledger 20-21. My heart pounded. We're in, Ethan whispered. Copy fast. I started the transfer, watching the progress bar crawl forward. 30%, 50, 65. The clock on the wall ticked louder than I remembered. Dana's eyes flicked between screens. You've got 5 minutes before the watchdog AI starts asking questions. 80%, 90. Almost there, Ethan muttered. Then the alarm blinked red across the screen. Security override detected. Dana cursed. They're tracing the proxy. Get out now. Not yet, I said. We need the checksum. Rowan, now or never. I reached into the system root and copied the hidden metadata field, the line that tied Linda's consultant ID to the forged encryption hash. The screen froze, then went dark. Download complete. Ethan said, voice taut. Disconnect. He pulled the plug killing power. The room fell into silence except for the hum of cooling fans. We stared at the dark monitors, hearts pounding. A full minute passed before anyone spoke. Dana finally exhaled. "You just stole a federal encryption log." I leaned back in the chair, adrenaline still burning in my veins. "No, I just reclaimed my father's name." We spent the rest of the night verifying the data offline. Every byte was intact. The checksum matched the cloned ID, perfectly tying it directly to Linda's account. Dana shook her head in disbelief. "If this gets out, she's finished, not just fired and indicted. Then we make sure it gets out the right way I said." Ethan rubbed his temples. "That's where it gets tricky. You can't just hand this to internal affairs. They're under her umbrella. We need someone above her." "General Harrison Whitaker," I said instantly. "He was my father's commanding officer. If anyone still believes in the Pierce name, it's him." Ethan hesitated. "He's powerful but cautious. You'll need undeniable proof." I tapped the drive. "Then let's make it undeniable." By dawn, the sky outside turned a pale gray rain streaking the windows. We had the evidence, the chain of custody, and a plan. But I knew Linda wasn't going to sit quietly. She'd already felt the ground shift beneath her. Somewhere in Arlington, she was probably staring at her own audit notice, realizing the machine she built was turning against her. That thought should have satisfied me. It didn't. It only made me colder. As I watched the sun rise, Ethan handed me a cup of coffee. "You know," he said, "there's still time to walk away." I smiled faintly. "You ever seen me walk away from a fight?" He laughed softly. "Not since Kabul." "Then you know how this ends," I said, with proof. And her silence. He nodded. "Then we better get ready for the noise first." I drove back to Fort Liberty with the evidence tucked into a small padded case under the passenger seat. The highway a ribbon of white lines that blurred with my heartbeat. Norfolk had given me what I needed: the checksum, the copied master file, a route map of her shell contractors. Ethan had mapped the audit window, and Dana had given us the 40-minute gap for extraction. All of it fit into one single opening next week at the Pentagon Review. That opening was my window, and windows close fast. I spent the next days preparing, not like a soldier readying for a mission with rifles and flashbangs, but like an investigator laying out exhibits for a jury. Every detail mattered. I had to present a counterproposal that would survive cursory inspection long enough to trigger an automated cross-check and force an internal review. It had to be clean public and impossible to dismiss as a prank or an error. I wrote and rewrote the text of the proposal until it sounded like something my father might have endorsed: clear, technical, and morally rigorous. I quoted him in the mission statement because nothing landed harder in their world than his name applied to integrity. I built the budget with conservative figures, intentionally modest, while specifying deliverables tied to transparency audits and encryption key management. The proposal was a legal instrument disguised as benevolence. If it passed routing, the system would see 2 official submissions with the same foundation ID and flag the conflict. That flag would escalate to a central audit team in D.C., and the duplication could not be swept away without a formal inquiry. Meanwhile, I prepared my personal movements. I requested temporary logistics clearance for a support role in D.C., ostensibly to assist with event coordination for the grant ceremony. The paperwork read clean. I knew how to make requests that sounded mundane and routine. Nobody questioned a support badge clipped to a plain uniform. Ethan helped me fabricate a cover manifest that tied me to permissible tasks at the event site, and Dana filed a benign administrative note through channels that would decrease the odds of random deep scans on my terminal activity. Every precaution was a thread weaved into the same rope. I also prepared my appearance. No dramatic uniforms, no slogans. I would not give her the satisfaction of a scene. I arranged to borrow a plain civilian jacket to wear over my standard support attire, a quiet choice meant to flatten me into the background of the ceremony until the moment I chose otherwise. I practiced the small behaviors that keep you invisible in crowded rooms: the neutral nod, the steady placement of a hand on a tray, the habit of looking as if you belong wherever you are. Old training, new disguise. The hardest part of preparation was not the documents or the fake manifests. It was managing the people around me, the ones who could fry the plan with casual curiosity. There are always those who like to talk, who trade rumor like baseball cards. I kept my circle tight. Ethan and Dana were the only ones who saw the entire map. A handful of others received compartmentalized tasks. A courier would move a single envelope. A contract clerk would log an innocuous item into the system to create the right digital breadcrumb. Everyone had orders and nothing more. Trust in this game wasn't sentimental. It was procedural. I also rehearsed my cadence for the reveal. If this worked the way we planned, the audit would escalate and the evidence would have to be reviewed in person. I would not storm a stage with accusations. I would offer a single object, a drive, a piece of data that could be independently verified and traced back to Linda's consultant node. I imagined the room in the Pentagon where the review would happen. Sterile lights, a bank of terminals, men and women who expected to see clean bureaucracy, not drama. That expectation would work in my favor. Systems designed to avoid scandal are terrible at recognizing intent when it is wrapped in paperwork. The proposal itself was finished a week before the ceremony. I left it untouched for a day, then reviewed it again with Ethan, who suggested tightening a single reference to contractor oversight to force the auditing algorithm to include the civilian oversight ledger. It was a small change, but that was the point. Small changes had toppled empires before. We ran through contingencies. If Linda moved to counter the audit before the committee convened, we had backup plans. Ethan could initiate a live feed to a secure node used by external partners, forcing the review into a higher-level channel. Dana could trigger an anonymous tip to Inspector General leadership if internal channels were compromised. The goal was to remove any possibility she could bury the duplication as administrative noise. I also prepared for the human element. Linda had power, but she was not omniscient. She relied on predictability patterns of approvals, timing Windows favors, called in like IOUs. I would introduce unpredictability. My movements would be loose, my access obvious but plausible. If she believed she could control me by spooking me into public outburst or flight, she would misread my actions as desperation. I planned to lean into that misreading. At night, when the plan felt like a fragile thing balancing on knife edges, I sat with my father's journal and read his notes on protocol and ethics. He had scribbled once in an impatient hand, "Institutions protect themselves at the speed of their paperwork. Use their rules to catch them." I repeated his line until it fit in the groove of my chest. It calmed me. The final pieces were logistical. I had to get a copy of the encrypted logs onto a secure chain that could be sealed and presented without being altered. Ethan and Dana built a mirrored vault on an isolated drive with redundant hashing and multiple witnesses in the chain of custody. We practiced the handoff until every motion was automatic. I practiced my face for the moment I would place that drive on a podium. I wanted a face that carried gravity without melodrama, a voice that sounded like a measured report, not a vendetta. There was one human thing left to do. I walked the route between the maintenance bay at Fort Liberty and the supply dock where the base vehicles loaded for D.C. I timed the stoplights, memorized the guard rotations, learned which officers smoked at which breakpoints. Knowledge of movement is a kind of power. It keeps you on schedule and off balance. The night before we left for D.C., Linda sent me a message folded in a protocol envelope, a short line. "Hope you find whatever piece you're looking for. Signed, L.P." It was a sentence meant to thaw me, to remind me of the theater she had perfected. I slid the note into my pocket and left it there. I slept for 2 hours and woke at 3. The world outside was a soft blur, the sky trading ink for gray. I packed the proposal, the secured drive spare chargers, a pen, and my father's small pocket coin he used to give me when he wanted to say without words that courage was not the absence of fear. Around me, the team moved like a machine. Ethan checked the routes one last time. Dana verified the vault seals. The courier practiced a casual gait for the handoff. At dawn, we would leave. We were not naive about the risk. We were not violent people planning a cheap revenge. We were methodical, detailed, and almost painfully legal in our approach. That was the point. The trap was a lesson in jurisdiction. Use the rules that prop the corrupt to collapse it. I locked the case and slid it into the glove compartment. The base woke in stages. Flags rose. Mess halls opened. The hum of transport began. For a moment, I looked at the empty patch where my captain bars once were. I had given up a lot, but I had not given up my judgment. As we rolled out toward the highway, I felt the same mix of dread and focus that comes before a training jump. The difference now was that the parachute was paperwork and the landing would be audible for the whole department to hear. The Pentagon building at night had its own pulse, a mechanical heartbeat beneath marble and glass. I'd been inside enough times to know that silence there was never empty. It was the sound of 1,000 systems humming, watching, remembering. I had 40 minutes. Ethan's voice crackled in my earpiece as I slipped into the auxiliary data room of the Norfolk Cyber Division branch. You're clear. Proxy relays are stable. Just copy the checksum folder and get out. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. The workstation belonged to a lieutenant on medical leave and his clearance was still active. Dana's doing. The terminal glowed pale blue as I logged in. The internal directory loaded slower than expected. Files scrolled by, most classified to eyes like mine, all humming with the weight of consequence. I plugged in the encrypted drive, the one containing our mirrored access key. The system accepted it, for a heartbeat relief. Then a message flashed, secondary authentication required. Ethan swore softly through the comm. That wasn't in the access tree. Override it, I whispered. I can't from here, Rowan. The firewall's segmental. You'll have to spoof the hash locally. I took a breath, forcing calm, and ran a manual hash inject through the auxiliary command line. The cursor blinked once, twice. Then the drive spun up the screen, flooding with green text. We're in, I murmured. Lines of data appeared like veins pulsing across a map. Contractor, Alpha 10M transaction, the log's approval, keys backup. I started copying. The progress bar crawled upward, agonizingly slow. 30%, Ethan said. I heard him typing furiously on the other end. The relay's stable. Just don't. He stopped. Wait. The room lights flickered once, then again. My heart dropped. On screen, a warning banner appeared. Unauthorized access detected. Security lockdown initiated. Red text. Flashing. I muttered, "Not now." Ethan's voice sharpened. "They're tracking you. Local subnet just pinged your IP. 2 nodes away from your workstation." I yanked the external drive out of the port. The copy froze at 72%, but the file we needed, the checksum, the proof was already inside. The door behind me hissed as hydraulics engaged. I slipped the drive into the inner pocket of my jacket, shutting down the terminal. Heavy footsteps echoed from the hall. "Ethan," I whispered. "They're close. Hold tight. I'm rerouting the trace through the personnel network. You've got maybe 90 seconds. I looked around. 1 exit. No windows. The security feed blinked red in the corner of the ceiling. Too late, I said under my breath. The handle turned. A uniformed guard stepped in, flashlight raised. "Ma'am, this room's restricted. I need to see your ID." My pulse didn't spike. Training took over. "Technical inspection," I said evenly. Lieutenant Mason requested a redundancy check before morning reports. His eyes narrowed. "That's not in my schedule." "Then maybe check again," I said, matching his calm with something colder. He hesitated, hand to his radio. At that moment, Ethan's voice cut through. "Got it. I ghosted your badge ID into the maintenance manifest. He'll get a clearance ping any second." The guard's radio buzzed. A voice came through. "All clear on sublevel 3. False alarm. Return to post." The guard frowned, tapping the earpiece. "Copy that." He looked at me again, less certain now. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "Perfectly," I said. He nodded, still suspicious, then left. The door sealed behind him. I exhaled slowly, pressing my back against the wall. My hand brushed the pocket where the drive rested its weight, sharp against my ribs. Ethan's voice came through softer now. "You okay?" "Close," I said. "Too close?" He chuckled dryly. "Close means alive. Let's get you out." I moved down the corridor, footsteps light, heart steady. As I passed the security camera at the end of the hall, its lens caught me for 1 second, the faint reflection of my face in the glass, half in light, half in shadow. That image would stay burned into their archive logs, but by the time anyone reviewed it, the data would already be gone. I reached the stairwell and stepped into the cool air of the service exit. The night outside smelled like rain and ozone. Package secured, I said quietly. Ethan exhaled on the other end. Then it's official. You just walked through a federal firewall and lived. Not walked, I said, pulling my hood over my head. Danced. And as I disappeared into the dark, alarms blared somewhere deep in the building, a reminder that the game had finally begun. The morning of the Pentagon Cyber Initiative ceremony looked almost unreal. Washington's air had that clean, filtered chill that came before rain. The granite buildings glowed faintly gold in the early light, and the streets outside buzzed with quiet security activity. The kind of calm that always comes before a controlled explosion, the bureaucratic kind. I arrived early, badge clipped to my civilian jacket credentials, reading Event Support, Logistics. Nobody questioned me. When people think they already know who you are, they stop seeing you. Inside the auditorium, crews adjusted lights over a stage framed with the DoD insignia and an enormous LED banner reading Building Integrity Through Technology. I almost laughed at the irony. Rows of seats faced the podium, each reserved with embossed name tags. Secretaries, colonels, contractors, and one at the center that read Linda Pierce, keynote speaker. Ethan was already inside, blending in with a group of IT coordinators. He caught my eye across the room, then gave a subtle nod toward the AV booth where Dana stood. She was setting up the mirrored display script that would trigger the dual projection when I gave the signal. Every step had been rehearsed down to the second. The USB drive from the breach sat in my jacket pocket, the key, the fuse, the truth. By 900, the room was full. Cameras positioned at both aisles streamed the event live to the Defense Press Network. I took my post by the side curtain where support personnel hovered unseen. When the lights dimmed, the moderator's voice filled the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Department of Defense Cyber Initiative Award Ceremony. Applause rippled through the room. I kept breathing slowly, counting heartbeats. Linda stepped onto the stage in a gray blazer and pearl necklace, her poise flawless, her smile bright enough to melt suspicion. She radiated authority, the perfect face for a lie. She began her speech with practiced grace. Today, she said, we honor those who defend the invisible frontiers, the guardians of our digital nation. This grant represents not just technology, but trust. Her voice carried with that calculated resonance that made people believe her. Behind her, the screen displayed the logo, General Marcus Pierce Memorial Cyber Defense Grant, $10 million allocation, my father's name glowing on a lie. I felt something twist inside me, not rage exactly. Clarity. Ethan's voice came softly through the comm. We're synced. Your file is queued. On your signal. I touched the drive through the fabric of my pocket, grounding myself. Linda continued pacing gracefully. This project was inspired by my late husband's commitment to honor and security. His daughter, Captain Rowan Pierce, was once part of this very mission before her reassignment. A few murmurs rippled. She smiled as though reminiscing, but her words were blades dipped in honey. Service takes many forms, and we all do what we can. I know he would be proud of her. Laughter, polite, controlled, spread through the audience. The humiliation was deliberate, theatrical. I waited until she gestured toward the display to reveal the funding approval slides. That was the cue. I turned slightly toward Dana at the booth. She caught the movement and pressed enter. The LED screen flickered, then split. 2 identical grant documents appeared side by side. Same title, same ID number, same encryption code. Except one was signed Linda Pierce and the other Rowan M. Pierce. The room didn't react at first. People blinked, confused. Then whispers began rising like static. Linda turned toward the screen, her composure cracking for the first time. That's not authorized, she said into the mic voice, still smooth but tightening around the edges. There's a mistake. The moderator frowned, signaling the tech crew. But Ethan's override had already locked the projection. The 2 documents hovered there in perfect symmetry, undeniable proof of duplication. I stepped forward from behind the curtain, slow and deliberate. A ripple went through the audience as they recognized me. Linda's jaw clenched. What are you doing here? She hissed, the microphone still live. You're not cleared to permission to clarify the chain of custody. I said, my voice steady but loud enough for every camera to hear. The phrase echoed across the hall, sharp and procedural. General Harrison Whitaker, seated in the front row, turned his head sharply. His gaze locked on me, assessing, remembering. He had been my father's commanding officer, the man who'd written his eulogy. Linda tried to intercept. "This is harassment," she said, forcing a laugh. Whitaker raised a hand. "Let her speak." The silence that followed was surgical. I stepped up to the podium beside her, the drive clutched in my palm. I could smell her perfume, cold and expensive, like steel. I placed the drive on the podium. "This contains the checksum logs of the Marcus Pierce Memorial Grant," I said clearly. "The file signatures are identical to those in your presentation, except one came from your office and one from a classified backup terminal 3 years old." Linda froze, her mask slipping. "You forged that." "No, ma'am," I said. "You did." The audience gasped, a sound like wind through glass. Cameras clicked. I turned slightly toward Whitaker. "Sir, my father's encryption key was unique. Before he died, he embedded his personal hash in every authorization he signed. The same hash appears here inside both files, which means his signature was used posthumously." Whitaker stood slowly. "You're saying she used your father's credentials." "I'm saying she used his name, sir." "And mine." Linda stepped back, color draining from her face. "You can't prove intent." "Intent doesn't need proving," I said softly. "The data proves itself." Ethan triggered the second feed, a projection of the metadata we'd extracted during the breach. It glowed behind us, timestamps routing IPs, Zurich transfers. Numbers, not emotion. Facts, not fury. The moderator tried to regain control. "We need to pause the broadcast," No Whitaker said sharply. "Let it run!" The crowd buzzed with energy, shock, disbelief, fascination, the kind that makes reputations collapse and headlines form. I could see phones raised recording. There was no going back. Linda leaned close to me, whispering through clenched teeth. "You think this redeems you? You think anyone will believe a disgraced officer?" I didn't look at her. "They don't have to believe me," I said. "They only have to read the file." She reached toward the drive, but I placed my hand over it first. The simple contact between our fingers was electric years of manipulation condensed into one frozen moment. I held her gaze and didn't blink. For the first time, she looked small, human, afraid. Whitaker's voice filled the silence. "Security, take custody of that evidence." 2 uniformed MPs approached. Linda took a half step back. Her control was slipping, and everyone saw it. She tried to smile for the cameras, but her voice trembled when she spoke again. "General, please." "This is a misunderstanding." "No, Linda," I said. "It's the truth catching up." The sound of cameras snapping became a storm. Flashes of white light ricocheted off the polished walls, each one freezing the moment in fragments. Linda's trembling hand, my unmoving stance, the flag rippling above the stage. General Whitaker stepped forward, the weight of his authority pressing down on the room. "Ms. Pierce," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Like a command on a battlefield, you will step away from that podium." Linda blinked rapidly, her charm fraying, her voice slipping into something brittle. "General, this is absurd. She's manipulating old data. This is a stunt." "The checksum doesn't lie," he said evenly. "And your name appears on both authorization records." He turned to the security detail. "Retrieve the evidence drive and escort Miss Pierce to holding." Gasps filled the hall as 2 MPs moved toward her. Linda stepped back instinctively, the microphone amplifying the small sound of her heel striking the stage. "You can't," she whispered, then louder. "You can't do this to me. I built this program." Her voice broke on the word built. I stood beside the podium, my hands clasped behind my back, breathing steadily. Whitaker looked toward me, eyes cold but not unkind. "Captain Pierce," he said deliberately, using my title. "You will remain here." I nodded once. "Yes, sir." It was the first time in years anyone had said that title without mockery, and it landed like a salve and a wound at once. Linda's gaze flicked toward me, disbelief warping into something darker. "You think this makes you righteous," she spat. "You think this will bring him back." The words hit, but I didn't flinch. "No," I said quietly. but it will let him rest. The MPs took her by the arms. She twisted once, her voice rising desperate now. "You're all fools! She's lying! That file she—" Her protests drowned under the rising murmur of the crowd. The camera zoomed in, catching the tremor in her lip, the shimmer of panic in eyes once cold. The same woman who had controlled every room she entered was now being escorted from the one she thought she owned. Her heels clicked across the stage, sharp and hollow, fading with each step. When the door shut behind her, the silence was thick, almost sacred. Whitaker turned back to the audience. "We will reconvene after internal verification," he said firmly. "This matter will be handled through official channels. For now, the broadcast remains archived for transparency." Then he looked directly at me. "Captain Pierce, you will accompany me to the review office." "Yes, sir." As I followed him off stage, the crowd parted without a word. Some faces were shocked. Reverent others, simply hungry for the story. I didn't care. Behind the curtain, Ethan was waiting, pale but grinning faintly. That he whispered was the cleanest hit I've ever seen. "It's not over," I said. "She'll fight it." Maybe he said, but now she has to do it in daylight. Dana appeared beside him, handing me a small envelope. "Internal audit confirmation. They already opened the case file." I nodded. "Good. Then let's finish this properly." Whitaker led us into a side chamber, smaller, quieter, lined with plaques and commendations. He shut the door and turned to me. "I knew your father well," he said. "He believed in systems and accountability. He would have hated what she did with his name." My throat tightened. "He deserved better, sir." "So do you," he replied. "Effective immediately, your suspension is lifted. You'll receive formal reinstatement pending review." I exhaled shakily. "Thank you." He looked at the drive in my hand. "This will go to the Inspector General directly. You've done something rare today, Captain. You've forced truth into a room designed to hide it." His words carried no sentiment, just weight. The kind that changes how air moves in your lungs. He extended his hand. I shook it. For a moment, the memory of my father saluting him flashed through my mind, a ghostly symmetry. Then Whitaker left, leaving only the faint scent of old leather and authority behind. Ethan leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You realize this footage is already viral, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "Viral. The live stream didn't cut when they tried. People saw everything. It's trending on the Defense Network feeds. You're the headline, Rowan." "I didn't do it for headlines," I said. "No," he said softly, "but sometimes justice needs an audience." Dana smiled faintly. "And sometimes the audience needs proof that truth still wins." I didn't answer. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving a hollow ache. When I stepped back onto the empty stage to retrieve the fallen folder, the hall looked smaller than it had before, stripped of illusion, just a room again. The flag behind the podium stirred slightly in the vented air. Its motion caught my eye, steady and defiant. I straightened my spine without thinking. "Years of training did that to you." I stood at attention, the lights dimmed. No cameras now. No applause. Just the faint hum of the projectors cooling. My reflection wavered on the polished floor, a ghost of who I had been standing beside, who I had become. The whisper of boots behind me made me turn. Ethan had followed. "You did it," he said simply. "No," I said. "We did." He nodded once. Outside the corridor, lights flickered from red to green, lockdown lifted. Somewhere beyond those walls, Linda Pierce was sitting in an interview room, her empire of forged trust unraveling line by line. I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance. The kind that comes after years of imbalance, like a body finally regaining its center of gravity. As we walked toward the exit, reporters shouted questions from the hallway. I kept my eyes forward. The flashbulbs stung, but I didn't blink. In the final shot that would circle through the news for days, I stood at the top of the Pentagon steps, the American flag unfurling above me. My hair whipped in the wind, the sky behind gray and unforgiving, but my face steady. They would call it a scandal, a betrayal, a redemption arc, all the words people use when they try to compress truth into narrative. I just called it duty. For the first time since my father's death, I had carried his name not as a burden, but as a weapon of honor. I raised my chin, hands at my sides, as the anthem from the nearby parade ground drifted faintly through the air. The cameras flashed one last time. Somewhere inside that building, systems reset and records rewrote themselves, but history, the humankind had already chosen its image, a daughter reclaiming her father's flag. And I stood there beneath it unflinching, letting the wind carry the weight of everything that had finally been set right. The morning after the ceremony, the headlines broke like gunfire across every channel Cyberfraud uncovered live at Pentagon Gala. My name was everywhere, attached to words I hadn't heard in years: honor, bravery, vindication. It didn't feel real. The footage replayed on loop Linda's frozen face, Whitaker's order, the flag behind me stirring in the air. For most people, it was spectacle. For me, it was aftermath. I woke in the small Arlington apartment Ethan had secured for me, the room still half dark, the hum of distant traffic faint through the glass. My uniform jacket hung on the back of a chair, empty but waiting. My father's coin sat on the windowsill, catching weak sunlight. I touched it without thinking, then turned on the TV. A reporter's voice filled the room. The Department of Defense confirmed today that consultant Linda Pierce has been taken into federal custody following allegations of fraudulent cyber grant activity. Sources within the Inspector General's office suggest multiple accounts linked to offshore transfers are under review. They showed her being led into a courthouse, sunglasses hiding her eyes, no words left to weaponize. I muted the sound. Watching her walk that same measured gait she'd used to control a room and realizing it was now just a mask slipping under pressure, I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. Justice doesn't feel like a parade. It feels like silence after a long storm. By noon, Whitaker's assistant arrived with a sealed envelope. My reinstatement orders. It was formal stamped, dated, and utterly devoid of emotion. Captain Rowan M. Pierce is hereby reinstated to active status effective immediately under advisory reassignment to the Army Cyber Command, Fort Meade, Maryland. I stared at the signature Whitaker's own, and beneath it the insignia of approval I had once lost. Ethan grinned when he saw it. "You did it, Captain." I smiled faintly. "We did it." "No," he said, leaning against the counter. "You stood in that room alone. You looked her in the eye and spoke truth into a system that tried to bury you. That was you." I didn't argue. He poured coffee, the smell grounding us both. "So what now?" he asked. "Back to duty." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just figure out what duty means when you've already lost everything once." In the following days, the investigations multiplied. The Inspector General's office issued official reports detailing how Linda had funneled funds through dummy foundations under the guise of veteran programs, all traced through the checksum we had exposed. The press devoured every update. Words like betrayal, whistleblower, and moral courage filled columns and broadcasts. Whitaker gave a statement to the media saying integrity must be defended by those willing to risk comfort for truth. Captain Pierce reminded us of that duty. It sounded like ceremony, but it mattered. It made my father's name whole again. Still, the days that followed weren't all redemption. The quiet after exposure is strange. Once the world stops watching, you're left with the echoes. Anonymous emails flooded my inbox, some calling me a hero, others accusing me of humiliation, of revenge disguised as virtue. The Army offered me therapy, relocation, media coaching. I refused all three. What I wanted was simpler time to breathe, to remember who I had been before the fight consumed me. One evening, I walked past the Pentagon reflecting pool. The surface was still mirroring the sky's pale wash of orange and silver. I thought about Linda, what she must have felt when the walls closed in. Control wasn't just her weapon, it was her identity. Taking it away had probably broken something inside her that would never heal. Part of me pitied her. Not for what she did, but for the emptiness that must have driven her to it. I remembered her words. "You think this will bring him back?" No, it hadn't. Nothing could. But it had restored something he'd taught me, that truth once unearthed belongs to everyone it touches. When I returned to Fort Meade weeks later, the air smelled the same metal coffee-cold glass, but everything else had shifted. Colleagues greeted me with cautious respect, as though unsure if I was myth or cautionary tale. Ethan rejoined the Norfolk unit under a promotion. Dana transferred quietly to the Inspector General's office as liaison. Our names were buried in reports, but our work echoed quietly through the new protocols that followed more oversight, tighter encryption, verification, dual signature authentication. Change small but real. During my first official briefing as reinstated officer, the director introduced me without fanfare. Captain Rowan Pierce will advise on ethical data governance and chain of custody review procedures. It sounded mundane, bureaucratic, perfect. The real victories are built inside boredom. The meeting ended and the director handed me a folder. You'll also receive commendation papers next month. The secretary wants to include you in a leadership series. I nodded. Thank you, sir. When I left the room, my reflection caught in the glass wall again. No longer the ghost in a janitor's uniform, but the woman who had rebuilt herself through persistence rather than forgiveness. That night, Ethan called from Norfolk. They're giving her a deal, he said. She's cooperating. She named contractors' middlemen 2 colonels. It's bigger than we thought. It usually is, I replied. And she detained indefinitely. She won't see open air for a while. I didn't celebrate. Every lie costs something, I said quietly. She just ran out of credit. He hesitated. You're not angry. No, I said. Just done. Before bed, I opened a letter that had arrived from the department archives. Inside was a declassified photo of my father and General Whitaker at a change of command ceremony years ago. My father's handwriting on the back read, "For Rowan, so you remember that truth isn't inherited, it's earned." I set it beside the reinstatement letter. 2 different worlds finally aligned. In early autumn, the Pentagon held a closed-door seminar on ethics and emerging technology. Whitaker asked me to deliver the keynote. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Standing at that podium again, facing a smaller, quieter crowd, I spoke not about corruption or betrayal, but about resilience. Every institution, I said, is only as honest as the people who refuse to let fear dictate silence. Systems fail, people falter, but integrity is rebuilt, one voice at a time. When I stepped down, Whitaker shook my hand. You turned shame into structure, Captain. That's rare, I smiled faintly. Maybe that's the real promotion, sir. Afterward, I returned to the apartment, took off the jacket, and sat by the window. Rain tapped against the glass. The coin on the sill gleamed faintly in the light of a passing car. Outside, somewhere across the Potomac, lights from the Pentagon shimmered through fog like a constellation of unfinished stories. I whispered into the quiet, not to my father this time, but to the part of myself that had survived everything. It's over, finally. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. Justice doesn't end. It changes form. It becomes quieter, slower, woven into the way you stand, the way you answer questions, the way you carry your name. I touched the coin again and smiled. The war I'd fought wasn't for revenge. It was for peace. And peace, I realized, isn't something the world gives you. It's something you claim one truth at a time. Dawn came quietly without ceremony. The sky over Arlington was the color of soft metal, pale and unassuming. I parked at the edge of the cemetery where the wind moved through endless rows of white stone, each name carved into silence. The grass was still wet, shining faintly in the morning light. In my hand, I carried a small object, the empty USB drive that had once held the proof. Its metal surface felt cool, almost weightless now that its purpose was fulfilled. The air smelled of dew and faint engine oil from the maintenance truck somewhere far off. No cameras, no generals, no witnesses. Just me, my father, and the truth that had finally surfaced. I walked between the graves until I reached his. General Marcus Pierce, U.S. Army Intelligence. The engraving caught the sunlight as if it were breathing. I stood there for a long moment, unable to speak. Then I knelt, pressing the drive gently into the soil at the base of the headstone. "It's over, Dad," I whispered. "They know now." The words came out rougher than I expected, like something breaking free after years of being held too tightly. A small gust of wind brushed against my cheek, cool and sharp. I could almost hear his voice again, calm, deliberate, reminding me that truth was never about victory, but about alignment, the quiet symmetry between what is right and what is done. I stayed there watching the morning unfold. The cemetery workers raised the flags one by one. The fabric snapped lightly in the wind, a sound that reminded me of marching drills at Fort Liberty. I remembered being a young lieutenant, then hungry for approval, believing that discipline could protect me from betrayal. It couldn't, but it had taught me endurance, the kind that lets you outlast the people who try to define you. The faint hum of a distant bugle carried through the air, low and steady, marking the hour. I closed my eyes and listened. It wasn't morning anymore. It was release. After a while, footsteps approached softly on the gravel path. I didn't turn. I already knew it was Ethan. He stopped beside me, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here," he said quietly. I took the cup warm against my hands. "Old habits." "Good ones," he said. We stood in silence for a while, the way soldiers do when words would only diminish the moment. He looked down at the headstone and nodded once. He'd be proud. Maybe I said. He'd probably tell me I broke protocol first. Ethan smiled. "Probably, but he'd forgive you." "He always did," I said softly. The wind shifted again, rustling the flags. Somewhere across the lawn, a group of new recruits stood in formation for a memorial service. Their uniforms gleamed under the sun. Watching them, I felt a strange blend of nostalgia and distance, the knowledge that I had once been them and that part of me always would be. Ethan sipped his coffee. "What happens now?" "I go back," I said, "but not the same way. I'm not fighting anymore. I'm building. You think they'll let you?" "They don't have to. I'll do it anyway." He smiled faintly. "Same old Captain Pierce." "Not the same," I said. Just finally whole. We stayed there until the sun cleared the horizon, lighting the marble rows in soft gold. I thought about Linda then, about the cost of deceit, about the loneliness that comes when you choose control over truth. Part of me wanted to hate her still, but I couldn't. Pity and understanding are strange twins. They arrive together when anger finally runs dry. "You ever think about what forgiveness means?" I asked quietly. Ethan glanced at me. "Sometimes. But I don't think it's for them." "No," I said. "It's for us. So we don't carry their weight forever." I finished my coffee and placed the cup beside the headstone next to the small patch of disturbed earth where the USB was buried. "You taught me that, Dad," I murmured. "That integrity doesn't end when people stop watching. It begins when you're alone." The breeze carried the words away, scattering them through the rows of markers where other families would visit, other soldiers would be remembered. It felt right, as if the truth I'd uncovered belonged here now, folded quietly into the larger memory of sacrifice and duty. Ethan touched my shoulder. "We should go." I nodded but didn't move. The sun had risen fully bright and unfiltered, washing the stones in light. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's story. This one was mine, imperfect, hard-won, unfinished. As we walked back toward the car, I looked once more over my shoulder at the grave, the flags, the sky. The wind caught the corner of my jacket, and for a fleeting second, I imagined my father's voice again. "You made it through Rowan. That's all I ever wanted." I smiled, not the kind that hides pain, but the quiet kind that acknowledges survival. "Yeah," I whispered. We did. We drove away in silence, the city waking around us. Somewhere behind the morning light spilled across the stones, glinting off the buried metal of a drive that had carried truth through fire. The flags kept waving, indifferent and eternal. And in that stillness, I understood redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes with quiet mornings like this one when the past finally stops whispering and the future waits patiently for you to breathe.